When most people look up at the Empire State Building, they see an icon. They see King Kong clinging to its spire. They see a limestone tower piercing the Manhattan skyline. They see the ultimate symbol of American ambition reaching toward the clouds. But almost no one remembers what stood there before. Almost no one knows that beneath the cold shadow of that famous skyscraper lies the ghost of something far more human, far more beautiful, and far more tragic. Where the Empire State Building now rises 1,154 feet into the air, there once stood the most magnificent hotel America had ever seen. A palace of marble and mahogany, of crystal chandeliers and velvet curtains, of champagne and secrets. It was called the Waldorf Astoria. And in 1929, at the height of its fame, at the peak of its power, it was torn down, demolished, erased. Not because it had failed, but because the land beneath it was worth more than the legend built upon it. This is the story of that hotel, a story of family hatred that built twin palaces side by side, a story of Gilded Age excess that invented modern luxury, a story of a man who died on the Titanic, leaving his monument behind, and ultimately, a story of how New York devours even its most beloved landmarks without hesitation, without mercy, and without looking back. The original Waldorf Astoria operated for only 36 years. But in that brief window, it became the beating heart of American high society, the birthplace of iconic dishes, and the standard by which all hotels would be measured. And then, in a matter of months, it vanished. What remains today is only memory, photographs, and the cold steel tower that rose in its place. A tower that, ironically, stood half empty for years, mocked as the empty state building while the nation sank into the Great Depression. This is not a story about progress. This is a story about loss. In the late 1800s, Manhattan was a city of transformation and contradiction. Millionaires built marble mansions along Fifth Avenue, while immigrants crowded into tenements only blocks away. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestone streets as the first electric lights flickered in the windows of the wealthy. The air smelled of coal smoke, fresh bread, and ambition. It was the Gilded Age, a time when fortunes were made overnight and lost just as quickly, when industrial barons lived like kings and the working class toiled in shadows. Society was divided not just by wealth, but by bloodlines, breeding, and the unspoken rules that governed who belonged and who did not. At the top of this glittering, ruthless pyramid sat the Astor family. The Astors were American royalty. Their fortune began with John Jacob Astor, a German immigrant who arrived in New York with little more than determination and a talent for making money. He built an empire through fur trading, real estate, and an almost supernatural ability to predict where the city would grow next. By the time of his death in 1848, he was the richest man in America. His descendants inherited not only his wealth, but also his position at the very center of New York society. To be an Astor was to be untouchable. To be invited to an Astor event was to be acknowledged as someone who mattered. But even among royalty, there are feuds. And the feud that would create the Waldorf Astoria was as bitter as it was petty, as personal as it was public. It began with two cousins who despised each other, William Waldorf Astor and John Jacob Astor IV. William Waldorf Astor was the eldest son of the eldest son, which meant he believed the family legacy belonged to him by birthright. He was serious, intellectual, and deeply proud. He served as a diplomat, wrote novels, and invested in newspapers. But more than anything, he craved respect. He wanted to be seen as more than just a rich man's heir. He wanted to be recognized as a leader, a statesman, a man of substance. Unfortunately for William, American society didn't see him that way. They saw him as cold, arrogant, and disconnected. His political ambitions fizzled. His literary work was largely ignored. And worst of all, he lived in the shadow of his aunt, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, better known as the Mrs. Astor. Mrs. Astor was the undisputed queen of New York society. She didn't need to raise her voice to command a room. Her approval could make a career, her disapproval could ruin a reputation. She famously declared that there were only 400 people in New York worth knowing, the exact number that could fit into her ballroom. If you weren't part of Mrs. Astor's 400, you simply didn't exist in the eyes of high society. and she made it very clear that William Waldorf was not her favorite nephew. She preferred his cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, the son of her husband's brother. John Jacob Astor IV was everything William was not. Handsome, charming, and adventurous, he was an inventor, a soldier, and a novelist. He built mechanical devices, wrote science fiction, and later served in the Spanish-American War. He was also scandalously bold in his personal life. Where William followed rules and traditions, John Jacob pushed boundaries. Society loved him for it. Mrs. Astor loved him for it, and William resented him for it. The tension between the two cousins simmered for years. They lived next to each other on Fifth Avenue, their mansions standing side by side between 33rd and 34th Streets. William's home sat on the corner of 33rd Street. John Jacob's mother, the formidable Mrs. Astor, lived in the mansion directly to the north. The proximity made the rivalry impossible to ignore. Every dinner party, every social event, every rumor and whisper reminded William that he would never be the favored son, never be the true heir to the family's social throne. In 1890, William made a decision that would change New York forever. If he couldn't win the respect he craved in America, he would leave. He moved to England, renounced his American citizenship, and eventually bought a British title, becoming the first Viscount Astor. But before he left, he did something calculated, something vengeful, something that would force his family to remember him. He announced that he was tearing down his Fifth Avenue mansion and building a hotel in its place. Not just any hotel, a grand, luxurious, world-class hotel that would bear his middle name, the Waldorf. The announcement sent shockwaves through New York society. Hotels were commercial establishments, places where travelers stayed temporarily. They were not supposed to exist on Fifth Avenue, the most exclusive residential street in America. Building a hotel there was an insult, a disruption, an act of social vandalism. And that was exactly the point. William wanted to force his aunt, Mrs. Astor, to live next door to a hotel. He wanted to turn her elegant, quiet neighborhood into a place of noise, crowds, and strangers. He wanted to make her uncomfortable. And it worked. Mrs. Astor was furious. She refused to accept the indignity of living beside a hotel. So, in 1893, she did what any self-respecting member of the 400 would do. She moved. She relocated further uptown to a new mansion on 65th Street and Fifth Avenue, leaving her old home behind. And then her son, John Jacob Astor IV, made his own announcement. He would tear down his mother's mansion and build an even grander hotel right next to William's. He would call it the Astoria. What had begun as a family feud was about to become the most famous hotel in the world. William Waldorf Astor hired the architect, Henry Janeway Hardenberg, to design his hotel. Hardenberg was already famous for designing the Dakota, the massive apartment buildings on the Upper West Side that looked like a French Renaissance chateau. For the Waldorf, he envisioned something equally grand but distinctly American, a building that combined European elegance with New York confidence. The Waldorf Hotel opened its doors on March 13, 1893. It stood 13 stories tall, a giant for its time, built of limestone and brick with a facade that exuded wealth and permanence. The entrance was marked by a grand porte cochere where carriages could pull up and deposit guests beneath a sheltered archway. Inside, the lobby stretched like a cathedral, filled with marble columns, gilded moldings, and elaborate frescoes painted on the ceilings. Crystal chandeliers hung from above, their light reflecting off polished floors and mirrored walls. Every surface gleamed, every detail whispered luxury. But the Waldorf wasn't just beautiful, it was revolutionary. Unlike the older hotels of the era, which were often drafty, dimly lit, and uncomfortable, the Waldorf offered modern conveniences that seemed almost magical. Every room had electric lighting, a luxury most homes didn't yet possess. There was a telephone switchboard that connected guests to the outside world. Private bathrooms were available in many suites, an extraordinary feature at a time when most people still shared communal facilities. The hotel also featured one of the first electric elevators in New York, allowing guests to glide smoothly from floor to floor without the jerking, dangerous climb of older steam-powered lifts. The public spaces were designed to impress. There was the Empire Room, a massive ballroom where society matrons held their grandest events. The Waldorf Cafe, which became the hotel's most famous space, was a place where gentlemen gathered to smoke cigars, sip brandy, and conduct business in an atmosphere of dark wood paneling and leather chairs. The restaurant, managed by the legendary maître d'hôtel Oscar Tschirky, better known as Oscar of the Waldorf, set a new standard for fine dining in America. Oscar invented dishes that would become classics, including the Waldorf salad, a simple but elegant combination of apples, celery, and mayonnaise that became a symbol of refined taste. The Waldorf was an instant success. Within weeks of opening, it became the place to see and be seen. Wealthy New Yorkers flocked to its restaurants and ballrooms. Out-of-town visitors stayed in its luxurious suites. Businessmen negotiated deals in its smoking rooms. Politicians held private meetings in its parlors. The hotel became a stage, and everyone who entered became part of the performance. But William Waldorf Astor never saw his creation reach its full glory. By the time the hotel opened, he was already living in England, focused on his new life abroad. He had made his point, built his monument, and moved on. The Waldorf belonged to New York now, not to him. Meanwhile, John Jacob Astor Forfus was preparing to make his own statement. He hired the same architect, Henry Hardenberg, and instructed him to build a hotel even larger and more opulent than the Waldorf. Construction began almost immediately on the site of Mrs. Astor's former mansion. The Astoria Hotel opened on November 1st, 1897, just 4 years after the Waldorf. The Astoria was everything John Jacob had promised. It was 17 stories tall, 4 stories higher than the Waldorf. Its facade matched the Waldorf's design, creating a visual unity between the two buildings that made them appear as one continuous structure. Inside, the Astoria offered even more grandeur, larger ballrooms, more elaborate dining rooms, and suites decorated with silk wallpaper, mahogany furniture, and Persian rugs. The Astor Gallery, a long corridor filled with paintings and sculptures, became one of the most photographed spaces in the city. But the true genius of the Astoria was its connection to the Waldorf. The two hotels were joined by a 300-foot corridor known as Peacock Alley, a name that perfectly captured its purpose. Peacock Alley was where society's elite paraded in their finest clothes, where women showed off the latest Paris fashions, and where men displayed their wealth and status. Walking through Peacock Alley wasn't just about getting from one hotel to the other. It was about being seen. It was theater. It was spectacle. It was the heartbeat of New York society. With the two hotels now connected, they operated as a single entity. Together, they became known as the Waldorf Astoria, written with a hyphen to signify their union. The combined hotel was the largest in the world, boasting over 1,000 rooms, a dozen restaurants and ballrooms, and a staff of more than 1,500 employees. It occupied an entire city block from 33rd to 34th Street along 5th Avenue, a massive palace of limestone and marble that dominated the skyline. The Waldorf Astoria wasn't just a hotel, it was a city within a city, a self-contained world of luxury and excess. The irony, of course, was that the hotel born from a family feud became the ultimate symbol of unity and grandeur. The two cousins who hated each other had accidentally created something far greater than either of them could have imagined. The Waldorf Astoria stood as proof that even bitterness and rivalry could produce beauty. For the next 3 decades, the Waldorf Astoria reigned as the center of American high society. Presidents stayed there, ambassadors negotiated there, titans of industry dined there, actors, singers, and writers mingled in its lobbies. The hotel witnessed engagements, scandals, political deals, and historic moments. It was where the city's power brokers gathered, where fortunes were made and lost over dinner, and where the future of America was quietly decided in wood-paneled rooms filled with cigar smoke and whispered conversations. To understand the true power of the Waldorf Astoria, you have to understand what it meant to walk through its doors. The hotel wasn't merely a place to sleep. It was a stage, a proving ground, a temple where the rituals of American aristocracy were performed daily. When you arrived at the entrance, your carriage or automobile was met by doormen in impeccable uniforms, men who could identify returning guests by sight and greet them by name. This wasn't accident, it was training. The hotel maintained detailed files on every guest, noting their preferences, their habits, their peculiarities. Did Mr. Vanderbilt prefer his morning paper with breakfast, or delivered to his room before dawn? Did Mrs. Whitney take tea at 4 o'clock exactly? The staff knew. The staff always knew. Inside the lobby, bellhops moved with practiced efficiency, carrying leather trunks and hat boxes up to suites that cost more per night than most families earned in a month. The marble floors gleamed under, constant polishing. The air carried the subtle scent of fresh flowers, orchids, roses, lilies, arranged in massive displays that were replaced daily. Everything was designed to communicate one message. Here, nothing was too good, nothing was too much, and nothing was impossible. The hotel employed over 1,500 people, an army of workers whose sole purpose was to maintain an illusion of effortless perfection. There were chambermaids who turned down beds and left chocolates on pillows. There were valets who pressed suits and polished shoes to mirror finishes. There were telephone operators who connected calls with quiet efficiency. There were engineers who kept the boilers running, the elevators moving, and the electric lights glowing. And above them all stood the management, led by George Bolt, the Swiss immigrant who became the hotel's legendary manager and who understood better than anyone that a great hotel was not just about luxury. It was about anticipation, about knowing what guests wanted before they knew it themselves. The hotel's influence extended far beyond New York. It set the standard for luxury hospitality around the world. Other cities built grand hotels inspired by the Waldorf Astoria's design. Hoteliers studied its operations, copied its menu, and tried to replicate its elegance. Oscar of the Waldorf became the most famous maitre d' in the world, and his dishes, Waldorf salad, eggs Benedict, Thousand Island dressing, became permanent fixtures on American menus. But Oscar's true genius wasn't in creating recipes. It was in understanding power. He knew that a table assignment could make or break a reputation, that being seated in the center of the dining room was a declaration of importance, while a table near the kitchen was a subtle insult. He cultivated relationships with the city's elite, remembering their favorite wines, their preferred dishes, their social enemies. He knew who was feuding with whom, who was courting whom, and who needed to be kept apart at all costs. The dining room was his kingdom, and he ruled it with the precision of a chess master. The hotel's restaurants became legendary destinations in their own right. The Palm Room featured a retractable glass ceiling that opened on warm evenings, allowing diners to eat beneath the stars while surrounded by potted palm trees and the soft music of a string orchestra. The Empire Room hosted elaborate banquets where 10-course meals were served on china edged with gold, where champagne flowed freely, and where the wealthy celebrated their wealth with unabashed extravagance. And then there was the Men's Cafe, a dark-paneled sanctuary where women were forbidden and where the real business of the city was conducted. Here, over cigars and brandy, deals were struck that would shape industries. Railroad tycoons negotiated routes. Bankers discussed mergers. Politicians made promises. The Men's Cafe was where the public performance of wealth gave way to the private reality of power. It was whispered that more money changed hands in that room than in any bank in the city. But beneath the glittering surface, the Waldorf Astoria carried shadows. It was a place of carefully maintained appearances, where wealth masked insecurity, where smiles hid cruelty, and where the rules of society were enforced with ruthless precision. The hotel may have been open to anyone who could afford a room, but its social spaces were strictly controlled. The ballrooms belonged to the 400. The dining rooms were monitored by Oscar, who decided who sat where. Peacock Alley was a runway for the elite, and anyone who didn't belong was made to feel it. The staff, for all their training and discretion, saw everything. They saw which men arrived with wives and which arrived with younger women who were decidedly not their wives. They saw businessmen celebrating deals while their competitors plotted in adjacent rooms. They saw politicians accepting envelopes thick with cash. They saw society matrons who smiled in public, but spoke viciously about each other in private. The hotel's corridors buzzed with gossip, carefully controlled and selectively shared, because information was currency in a place where everyone had something to hide. And then there were the secrets. Every grand hotel has them. The affairs conducted in private suites, the business deals made behind closed doors, the scandals carefully hidden from the press. The Waldorf Astoria was no different. It was a place where men brought mistresses, where marriages crumbled, where fortunes were gambled away, and where reputations were destroyed. The hotel's thick walls and discreet staff ensured that what happened inside stayed inside. There were whispered stories that would never make the newspapers. The socialite who overdosed on laudanum in her suite and whose death was quietly ruled a heart attack. The financier who lost everything at the hotel's illegal card tables and jumped from a window on the 12th floor. The married senator found in a compromising position with a chorus girl, an incident that was resolved with money and threats and the timely intervention of the hotel's management. These stories circulated among the staff, passed from chambermaid to bellhop to kitchen worker, never written down, never confirmed, but always remembered. The hotel also bore witness to genuine tragedy beyond scandal. During the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, several guests died in their rooms, their bodies removed quietly to avoid panic. The hotel staff worked through the crisis, many falling ill themselves, some never recovering. The chandelier-lit ballrooms that had hosted celebrations were temporarily converted into makeshift infirmaries. The hotel that had symbolized invincibility revealed itself to be as vulnerable as any other place when death came calling. Yet even tragedy couldn't diminish the hotel's mystique. If anything, it added to the layers of history that accumulated within its walls. Every room held stories. Every corridor echoed with the ghosts of past conversations. The hotel became a repository of memory, a place where the past and present existed simultaneously, where you could walk the same halls that had been walked by presidents and criminals, saints and sinners, lovers and enemies. But no amount of discretion could protect the hotel from the tragedy that would mark its history forever. In the early years of the 20th century, John Jacob Astor IV remained one of the hotel's most prominent figures. Though he spent much of his time traveling, inventing, and pursuing various business ventures, he always returned to the Waldorf Astoria. It was his creation, his legacy, and a symbol of his place in the world. In 1909, at the age of 47, John Jacob shocked New York society by divorcing his wife, Ava Lowell Willing. Divorce was scandalous enough, but what followed was even worse. He soon began courting Madeleine Talmadge Force, the 18-year-old daughter of a respectable Brooklyn family. The age difference, nearly 30 years, caused an uproar. Society matrons whispered. Newspapers published scathing editorials. Even his own family expressed disapproval. But John Jacob didn't care. In 1911, he married Madeleine in a quiet ceremony. To escape the gossip and judgment, the couple left New York and embarked on an extended honeymoon abroad, traveling through Europe and Egypt. By early 1912, Madeleine was pregnant, and the couple decided it was time to return home. They booked passage on the newest, most luxurious ocean liner in the world, a ship that promised speed, comfort, and absolute safety. It was called the RMS Titanic. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. The ship that was supposed to be unsinkable began to sink. Chaos erupted. Lifeboats were lowered. Women and children were prioritized. John Jacob Astor IV helped his pregnant wife into Lifeboat 4, then stepped back onto the deck. He was last seen standing calmly near the bridge, smoking a cigarette and watching the lifeboats descend into the dark water. He knew he was going to die, and he faced it with the same calm confidence he had shown throughout his life. His body was recovered days later, identified by the initials sewn into his jacket and the significant amount of money found in his pockets. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, co-creator of the Waldorf Astoria, died at the age of 47. His death became one of the most famous casualties of the Titanic disaster, a tragedy that symbolized the end of an era. Back in New York, the news sent shockwaves through the city. The Waldorf Astoria, which John Jacob had helped build, became a place of mourning. Flags flew at half-mast. Memorial services were held. Guests walked through Peacock Alley in silence, remembering the man who had made the hotel possible. For many, his death felt like an omen, a sign that the Gilded Age, with all its excess, confidence, and belief in progress, was coming to an end. And in many ways, it was. The years following John Jacob Astor IV's death were marked by change and uncertainty. World War I erupted in 1914, bringing an end to the carefree opulence of the pre-war years. Young men who had danced in the Waldorf Astoria's ballrooms now fought in the trenches of Europe. The hotel itself transformed during the war, hosting military events, fundraising galas, and somber gatherings for families who had lost sons overseas. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to solemnity. After the war, the 1920s brought a new kind of energy to New York. The city roared with jazz music, speakeasies, flappers, and a frenetic sense of freedom. But this new world didn't quite fit the Waldorf Astoria's old elegance. The hotel still attracted wealthy guests, but it no longer felt like the center of the universe. Younger, more modern hotels were being built. The social rules that had governed the 400 were loosening. The world was changing, and the Waldorf Astoria, for all its grandeur, was beginning to feel like a relic of a bygone era. But the hotel was still profitable. It was still famous. It was still beloved. And if not for one simple fact, the extraordinary value of the land it sat on, it might have stood for decades more. By the mid-1920s, Manhattan real estate had become the most valuable in the world. Fifth Avenue was no longer a quiet residential street. It was now the heart of commerce, lined with department stores, office buildings, and the headquarters of major corporations. The old mansions that had once defined the avenue were being torn down one by one, replaced by towering skyscrapers. Land that had been worth thousands per square foot in the 1890s was now worth millions. The Waldorf Astoria sat on one of the most valuable plots in the city, an entire block of Fifth Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets. To developers and real estate investors, the hotel was no longer a landmark. It was an inefficient use of space. It was a low building on high-value land. It was, quite simply, in the way. In 1928, the Astor family made a decision that would erase the hotel forever. They sold the land. The buyer was a group of investors led by John J. Raskob, a former executive at General Motors and DuPont, and Coleman DuPont, an industrialist with a vision for the tallest building in the world. Their plan was audacious: demolish the Waldorf Astoria and construct a skyscraper so tall, so iconic, that it would define the Manhattan skyline for generations. They would call it the Empire State Building. The announcement came as a shock. For many New Yorkers, the idea of tearing down the Waldorf Astoria felt almost sacrilegious. This wasn't just a hotel, it was a piece of the city's soul. It was where history had happened. It was where memories had been made. It was irreplaceable, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. And in New York, nothing is sacred when money is involved. On May 3, 1929, the Waldorf Astoria closed its doors for the final time. A farewell dinner was held in the ballroom, attended by former guests, employees, and city officials. Speeches were made, toasts were raised, tears were shed. Oscar of the Waldorf, now an old man, stood in the dining room he had ruled for decades and said his goodbyes. The chandeliers glowed one last time. The orchestra played one final song, and then, in the early hours of the morning, the lights went dark. The farewell was bittersweet, tinged with nostalgia and regret. Former guests stood in Peacock Alley for the last time, remembering the countless times they had walked its length, dressed in their finest, performing for an audience of their peers. They touched the marble columns, ran their hands along the polished wood railings, and tried to memorize details they knew would soon be lost forever. Older employees wept openly. Many had worked at the hotel for decades, some since the day it opened. The Waldorf Astoria wasn't just their workplace. It was their identity, their home, the center of their lives. Newspaper reporters filled the hotel that final night, interviewing guests and capturing the melancholy atmosphere. The New York Times wrote that the closing felt like the end of an epoch, noting that the hotel had been more than a building. It was an institution, a symbol, a piece of living history. Other papers published photographs of the hotel's most famous spaces, preserving them in print for future generations who would never see them in person. Some guests pocketed small souvenirs, matchbooks, menus, pieces of stationery embossed with the hotel's crest. These items, worthless in themselves, would become treasured keepsakes, physical reminders of a place that had meant something profound. Years later, they would be found in attic trunks and estate sales, small fragments of a vanished world. The demolition began almost immediately. Wrecking crews moved in with sledgehammers, crowbars, and dynamite. Unlike today, when historic buildings are sometimes carefully deconstructed with their materials salvaged and repurposed, the destruction of the Waldorf Astoria was brutal and efficient. There was no sentiment, no reverence for the beauty being destroyed. This was business. The faster the hotel came down, the faster construction could begin on the Empire State Building. Time was money, and money was all that mattered. Within days, the grand entrance was reduced to rubble. The porte cochere, where carriages had once deposited wealthy guests, was smashed into fragments. Within weeks, the marble columns that had supported the lobby ceiling were toppled, their carved capitals cracked and broken. Within months, the entire structure was gone. The Waldorf Astoria, which had taken years to build and decades to perfect, was erased in a matter of months. Photographs from the demolition show scenes of almost apocalyptic destruction. In one image, workers stand amid a landscape of shattered marble and twisted metal, the ornate details of the hotel's interior reduced to unrecognizable debris. In another, a chandelier lies broken on the ground, its crystals scattered like diamonds in the dust. In yet another, a portion of the facade still stands, its windows dark and empty, while the rest of the building has been reduced to nothing but rubble piles. The workers who demolished the hotel were mostly recent immigrants, Italians, Irish, Poles, men who had come to America seeking opportunity and who now found themselves tearing down the very symbol of American success. They worked in clouds of dust, breathing in the powdered remains of plaster and marble. They swung sledgehammers against walls that had once echoed with laughter and music. They loaded debris into trucks bound for landfills, where the fragments of the Waldorf Astoria would be buried and forgotten. Some of the hotel's fixtures were sold at auction. The massive chandeliers, the ornate mirrors, the hand-carved wooden paneling, all were offered to the highest bidder. Some were purchased by other hotels, hoping to capture a piece of the Waldorf Astoria's magic. Others went to wealthy collectors who wanted to install them in their private homes. But most of the hotel's contents were simply destroyed. The cost of removing and storing the fixtures exceeded their resale value. It was cheaper to smash them than to save them. The site became a massive crater, a wound in the Manhattan landscape. Steel workers arrived and began building the Empire State Building's foundation, driving steel beams deep into the bedrock where the hotel had once stood. The construction was a marvel of speed and efficiency. The Empire State Building rose at a rate of 4.5 stories per week, a pace that seemed almost impossible. Workers competed to set records, racing to complete the structure faster than anyone thought possible. But the speed came at a cost. 5 workers died during construction, falling from scaffolding or crushed by falling materials. Their deaths barely made the newspapers. They were anonymous men, their names forgotten, their sacrifices unremembered. The city was focused on the triumph of the new building, not the human cost of its creation. The timing of the demolition was cruelly ironic. The Waldorf Astoria closed in May 1929. In October 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging the United States into the Great Depression. Suddenly, the optimism that had fueled the Empire State Building's construction evaporated. Businesses failed, fortunes disappeared, unemployment soared, and the new skyscraper, completed in 1931, stood half empty for years. Its office spaces remained vacant. Its retail floors attracted few tenants. It became known derisively as the Empty State Building, a hollow monument to a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The irony was not lost on New Yorkers. The Waldorf Astoria had been demolished because the land was supposedly too valuable to waste on a hotel. But now, that same land supported a building that couldn't find tenants, that generated little revenue, that stood as a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes could turn. The hotel, which had been profitable until its final day, had been sacrificed for a skyscraper that became a financial disaster. Meanwhile, the Waldorf Astoria itself was not entirely gone. Recognizing the public's attachment to the name and hoping to capitalize on the brand's reputation, the hotel's operators announced that a new Waldorf Astoria would be built further uptown, on Park Avenue between 49th and 50th Streets. This new hotel, designed in the Art Deco style that was becoming fashionable, opened in 1931. It was grand, modern, and luxurious, boasting 2,000 rooms and every modern convenience. But it was not the same. The new Waldorf Astoria lacked the history, the soul, the accumulated memories that had made the original so special. It was a hotel, and a fine one, but it was not the hotel. Guests who had known the original walked through the new building and felt the difference immediately. The architecture was sleeker, but less intimate. The spaces were larger, but less personal. The new hotel could be admired, but it could not be loved the way the original had been loved. Old employees who found work at the new location often spoke wistfully about the original. They remembered specific rooms, specific guests, specific moments that could never be recreated. The new Waldorf Astoria became successful in its own right, hosting presidents and celebrities and continuing the tradition of luxury hospitality. But it lived in the shadow of its predecessor, forever compared to something that no longer existed except in memory. And the original, the real Waldorf Astoria, the one born from a family feud, the one that had hosted presidents and millionaires, the one where John Jacob Astor IV had walked before boarding the Titanic, was gone forever. Today, if you stand on the corner of 5th Avenue and 34th Street, you can look up at the Empire State Building and try to imagine what once stood there. You can picture the grand entrance, the marble lobby, the glittering chandeliers. You can imagine Oscar of the Waldorf greeting guests. You can picture John Jacob Astor IV standing in Peacock Alley, confident and proud. You can hear the laughter, the music, the clink of champagne glasses. But all of that exists only in memory now. The physical structure is gone. The rooms where deals were made, the ballrooms where debutantes danced, the suites where secrets were whispered, all of it was reduced to rubble and carted away. What remains are photographs, faded and sepia-toned, showing a world that feels impossibly distant. There are menus, carefully preserved in archives, listing dishes that no longer exist. There are newspaper articles, breathless and admiring, describing a hotel that seemed too magnificent to ever disappear. And there are stories passed down through families, through hotel employees, through historians who refuse to let the past be forgotten. Stories of elegance and excess, of beauty and betrayal, of a time when New York was both more glamorous and more ruthless than it is today. The tragedy of the original Waldorf Astoria is not just that it was destroyed. The tragedy is that it was destroyed at the height of its fame, demolished not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. The land beneath it had become too valuable. The city had grown too hungry. And so, the hotel was sacrificed on the altar of progress, a victim of the very success it had helped create. The story of the Waldorf Astoria is, in many ways, the story of New York itself, a city that builds monuments and then tears them down, a city that values the future more than the past, a city that never stops moving, never stops changing, never stops devouring its own history. The hotel that William Waldorf Astor built out of spite, and John Jacob Astor IV expanded out of pride, became a symbol of an era. And when that era ended, the hotel ended with it. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story is this. The Empire State Building, the structure that replaced the Waldorf Astoria, became one of the most beloved landmarks in the world. It is adored, photographed, and celebrated. Tourists travel from across the globe to visit it. It appears in countless films, songs, and works of art. It has become synonymous with New York, with ambition, with the American dream. And yet, almost no one remembers what it destroyed. The Waldorf Astoria's legacy, however, endures in unexpected ways. The new hotel on Park Avenue continues to operate, hosting world leaders, celebrities, and dignitaries. The name still carries weight, still suggests luxury and sophistication. The dishes invented by Oscar of the Waldorf salad, eggs, Benedict, remain staples of American cuisine. The standards the hotel set for service, elegance, and hospitality influenced every luxury hotel that came after it. But more than that, the original Waldorf Astoria lives on as a reminder of what we lose when we prioritize profit over preservation, when we choose the new over the historic, when we let the wrecking ball swing without asking what we are destroying. The hotel's story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What do we owe to the past? What should be saved? And what should be allowed to disappear? And when we erase history to build the future, what part of ourselves do we lose in the process? The original Waldorf Astoria was a product of its time, a time of extraordinary wealth, rigid social hierarchies, and unapologetic excess. It was built by two men who hated each other, and yet it became a place where people came together. It was a monument to vanity, and yet it created genuine beauty. It was exclusive and elitist, and yet it set standards that democratized luxury, making fine dining and elegant hospitality something that could be experienced, imitated, and aspired to. The hotel's destruction in 1929 marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new one. The Empire State Building that replaced it symbolized a different kind of ambition, not the intimate grandeur of a private palace, but the soaring, impersonal ambition of corporate America. The shift from the Waldorf Astoria to the Empire State Building was the shift from the Gilded Age to the modern age, from a world defined by families and bloodlines to a world defined by business and technology. And in that shift, something was lost, something irreplaceable. The story of the Waldorf Astoria teaches us that even the most magnificent creations are temporary. Even the grandest monuments can be erased. Even the most beloved landmarks are vulnerable. In a city like New York, nothing lasts forever. Buildings rise and fall, neighborhoods transform. History is written and rewritten and written again. But the story also teaches us that memory is powerful. Even though the original Waldorf Astoria is gone, it is not forgotten. Its name lives on. Its influence endures. Its story continues to be told, passed down through generations, preserved in archives, remembered by those who care about the past. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all, that the things we build are less important than the stories we tell about them. That a hotel can be demolished, but the memory of what it represented cannot be. That progress is inevitable, but loss is real. And that sometimes the most tragic stories are the ones that force us to remember what we would rather forget. The original Waldorf Astoria stood for 36 years. In the grand sweep of history, that is barely a moment. And yet, in that brief moment, it changed the world. It set a standard. It created a legend. It built a stage where history happened. And then, one day, it was gone. Torn down to make room for something taller, something newer, something that would cast a longer shadow. The Empire State Building rose from the rubble, a monument to ambition and progress. But beneath its foundation, buried under steel and concrete and the weight of decades, lies the ghost of the Waldorf Astoria, a palace of marble and memory, a legend erased by the very city that created it. Today, when you stand at the base of the Empire State Building and look up at its towering height, remember this: you are standing on hallowed ground. You are standing where society once gathered, where Oscar once served his famous salad, where John Jacob Astor IV once walked before, boarding a doomed ship. You are standing on a grave that holds not just a building, but an entire world. The Waldorf Astoria is gone, but its story remains. And as long as someone tells that story, as long as someone remembers what stood there before the skyscraper, the hotel will never truly die. It will live on in the cracks between the city's stones, in the whispers of history, and in the hearts of those who understand that sometimes the things we lose are more important than the things we build. This is the tragic story of the hotel erased by the Empire State Building, a story of ambition and arrogance, of beauty and bitterness, of a family feud that created a monument, and of a city that destroyed that monument without a second thought. It is a story of the Gilded Age, of the Titanic, of the Great Depression, and of the cold mathematics of real estate that values land over legacy. It is a story of loss, and loss, unlike the buildings we tear down, lasts forever. On a limestone ridge overlooking the rolling farmland of central Pennsylvania, there stands a mansion that was built to celebrate the American dream. High Point, as it was called, rose above the chocolate factory town of Hershey like a crown upon a hill, a symbol of one man's triumph over poverty and failure. From its windows, Milton Hershey could survey everything he had created: the factories, the schools, the parks, the neat rows of workers' homes stretching toward the horizon. But on the morning of April 7, 1937, if Milton Hershey had looked down from those windows, he would have witnessed something that shattered the illusion of his perfect town. 3,000 men armed with baseball bats, clubs, and ice picks were storming his chocolate factory. They were not invaders from outside. They were his own people, loyal workers and dairy farmers who had decided to take matters into their own hands. Inside the factory, hundreds of striking workers realized too late that their peaceful sit-down protest was about to turn violent. The mob outnumbered them 4-1. Within minutes, the violence would be over, but the mythology of Hershey, Pennsylvania, the utopian company town, the workers' paradise, the chocolate-scented Eden, would never be the same. This is the story of High Point Mansion, the house that chocolate built. But it is also about what happens when a benevolent dictator builds a perfect world and discovers that perfection cannot be maintained by good intentions alone. This is about paternalism and resentment, of prosperity and exploitation, of a visionary who gave his workers everything except the one thing they ultimately demanded: their freedom. To understand how paradise turned to violence, we must first understand the man who built it all and the empire that rose from failure and determination. If you enjoy uncovering the darker histories hidden behind grand estates, you're welcome to subscribe and explore more with me. Milton Snavely Hershey was born in 1857 to Swiss and German immigrant parents in rural Pennsylvania. His childhood was marked by instability. His father Henry chased failed business ventures, while his stern Mennonite mother Fanny held the family together through faith and hard work. Milton attended perhaps 7 different schools, never progressing beyond a 4th grade education. At 14, he was apprenticed to Joseph Royer, a confectioner in Lancaster, where he discovered a passion for candy making that formal schooling had never awakened. For 4 years, he learned the art of confectionery, mastering not just techniques, but innovation. What followed were 15 years of spectacular failures. Milton opened candy businesses in Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, and New Orleans. Each one collapsed, leaving him deeper in debt. By 1886, he was 30 years old, with nothing but broken dreams. But he tried once more in Lancaster, borrowing $700 to start the Lancaster Caramel Company. Using fresh milk from local dairy farms, he created a superior product. This time, fortune smiled. Within years, he was operating multiple factories and had become wealthy. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Milton saw German chocolate-making machinery and became obsessed with a new vision. He saw the possibility of mass production, making chocolate affordable for ordinary Americans. In 1900, Milton sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million, roughly $35 million today. At 43, he could have retired wealthy. Instead, he bet everything on chocolate and decided to build something unprecedented. Not just a factory, but an entire town designed for his workers. He would call it Hershey. In 1903, Milton Hershey purchased farmland 30 miles northwest of Lancaster, near his birthplace in Derry Township. The land was remote, rolling hills and dairy farms far from major cities. But Milton saw advantages. Dairy farms that could supply fresh milk, Spring Creek providing water, and beautiful countryside where workers could live healthy lives far from industrial cities. Construction began immediately. The chocolate factory rose first, but Milton's vision extended far beyond its walls. He would build an entire town from nothing, and it would be like no company town America had ever seen. By 1905, the factory was operational and the town was taking shape. The streets were paved and electrically lit. Every worker's home had electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating, amenities still rare in cities and almost unheard of in rural areas. Houses were solidly built and arranged along tree-lined streets with whimsical names: Chocolate Avenue and Cocoa Avenue, Trinidad and Araba, Para and Java. Each street name, a reminder that this town existed because of a bean that grew thousands of miles away. A public trolley system connected Hershey to nearby towns. There was a bank, a department store, a free consolidated school, churches, a YMCA, and, a library. On May 30th, 1906, Milton opened Hershey Park along Spring Creek, initially a picnic ground that grew into an elaborate attraction. In 1910, he added the Hershey Zoo with exotic animals from around the world. Everything was designed with workers' welfare in mind. There were baseball fields and tennis courts, swimming pools and golf courses. The air smelled perpetually of chocolate, a sweet aroma that drifted from the factory and settled over the town like a blessing. In 1909, Milton and his wife Catherine, who had no children of their own, established the Hershey Industrial School for orphaned boys, wanting to give children the opportunities Milton himself had nearly been denied. Journalists and reformers came from around the world to study this Pennsylvania miracle. Here was proof that capitalism didn't have to be cruel, that industrialists could prosper while providing workers with dignity and quality of life. And in 1908, with his town flourishing, Milton built himself a mansion worthy of his success. Milton chose the highest point in the area for his home, a limestone ridge that commanded sweeping views of the factory below and the surrounding countryside. The location was symbolic. From this elevated position, Milton could literally oversee everything he had created, watching his workers arrive at the factory each morning, seeing the trolleys move through the streets, observing the children playing in the parks he had built for them. High Point Mansion was completed in 1908, and it reflected Milton's character perfectly. The house was substantial but not ostentatious, a reflection of his Mennonite upbringing and his belief that excess was sinful. While other industrialists of the era were building palaces with marble ballrooms, gold-leafed ceilings, and dozens of servants, Milton's mansion was relatively modest by Gilded Age standards. The architecture was elegant and refined, featuring clean lines and classic proportions. The exterior presented a dignified face to the world, solid, permanent, prosperous, without being pretentious. It was built of brick and stone, materials that would endure for generations, just as Milton hoped his town would endure. Inside, High Point revealed the hand of a man who valued quality craftsmanship and comfort over showiness. The reception rooms featured fine woodwork, carved mantels, wainscoting, and built-in cabinetry that demonstrated the skill of local craftsmen. The floors were polished hardwood, rich and warm. Large windows in every major room flooded the interior with natural light and provided those commanding views of the town below. The mansion had all the modern conveniences that Milton had insisted upon for his workers' homes, and then some. Electric lighting throughout, when many rural estates still relied on gas lamps or candles. Indoor plumbing with hot and running water. Central heating that kept the house comfortable even during harsh Pennsylvania winters. A telephone connected Milton to his factory and offices. But the house wasn't cold or institutional, despite its modernity. Catherine Hershey, called Kitty by those who knew her, made High Point a warm and welcoming home. She decorated the rooms with comfortable furniture, hung paintings on the walls, filled vases with fresh flowers from the gardens. The couple entertained modestly, hosting dinners for business associates and community leaders, but nothing approaching the lavish parties that characterized other industrialists' estates. The grounds surrounding High Point were landscaped with the same attention to detail that Milton brought to everything. Gardens were planted with native trees and flowering shrubs. Pathways wound through the property, offering quiet places to walk and think. From these gardens, the views were even more spectacular. The chocolate factory in the middle distance, its smokestacks rising against the sky, and beyond it, the grid of streets and houses that formed the town. Milton and Catherine had no children, and this sorrow permeated High Point. The rooms that might have echoed with the laughter of sons and daughters remained quiet. This childlessness was one of the driving forces behind their decision to establish the Hershey Industrial School. If they could not have children of their own, they would become parents to hundreds of boys who desperately needed the opportunities that Milton had nearly been denied. From High Point's windows, particularly from the upper floors, Milton could watch his town wake up each morning. He could see the workers walking or taking the trolley to the factory. He could observe children heading to school. He could watch the town's daily rhythms unfold beneath him, like a living organism that he had brought into being through sheer force of will and vision. The mansion stood as physical proof of what could be achieved through determination and innovation. Milton had been born in poverty, had failed repeatedly, had been dismissed as a dreamer who would never amount to anything. Now he lived in a mansion on a hill, overseeing an empire built on chocolate, surrounded by a town that bore his name and reflected his values. But High Point was more than just a home. It was a command center, a place from which Milton could oversee his expanding empire. He often worked from home, receiving reports from factory managers and town administrators, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The mansion became a symbol not just of his personal success, but of his ongoing control over every aspect of the community he had created. In March 1915, tragedy struck High Point. Catherine Hershey died after a long illness. She was just 52 years old. Milton was devastated. He had lost his partner, his companion, the woman who had shared his vision and helped him create something meaningful from their wealth. Catherine's death changed Milton profoundly. High Point became a lonelier place, haunted by memories of happier times. Milton threw himself into work and philanthropy with renewed intensity, as if he could outrun his grief through constant activity. In November 1918, still mourning Catherine, Milton made an extraordinary decision. He placed almost his entire fortune, including control of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation, into a perpetual trust for the benefit of the Hershey Industrial School. The trust was worth roughly $60 million at the time, equivalent to nearly $1 billion today. When asked why he had given away such an enormous fortune, Milton's answer was characteristically straightforward. "I never could see what happiness a rich man gets from contemplating a life of acquisition only, with the cold and legal distribution of his money after he is gone." High Point remained Milton's home through the prosperous 1920s, as his chocolate empire continued to grow and his town became internationally famous. The mansion stood witness to Milton's greatest triumphs and his deepest sorrows, a silent observer of history unfolding in the valley below. And in 1937, from those same windows where Milton had watched his town prosper and grow for nearly 3 decades, he would witness the collapse of his utopian dream. When the Great Depression began in 1929, company towns across America crumbled, but Hershey, Pennsylvania seemed immune. Americans still bought chocolate, and the Hershey Chocolate Corporation made more than $37 million in after-tax profits between 1930 and 1936. Milton Hershey, now in his 70s, launched his Great Building campaign. Rather than lay off workers, he would spend millions employing them to build monuments that would define Hershey for generations. In 1930, the Hershey Country Club opened with beautifully landscaped golf courses. But Milton's greatest ambition was the Hotel Hershey, begun in 1931. He chose another hilltop location where the building would command sweeping views of the valley below. The Hotel Hershey was designed in Spanish colonial revival style, inspired by hotels Milton had seen in Cuba. The building rose like a Mediterranean palace, cream-colored stucco walls, red tile roofs, arched windows and doorways. A fountain courtyard featured intricate tile work and flowering gardens. Inside, the hotel was spectacular. The lobby featured marble floors and columns, ornate plasterwork, crystal chandeliers. The guest rooms had fine furniture and modern amenities. The Hotel Hershey opened in May 1933, employing hundreds and drawing visitors from across the nation. That September, the Hershey Theater opened, an Art Deco masterpiece with a marble lobby, grand staircase, and murals depicting theatrical history. The auditorium seated nearly 2,000, its ceiling painted with gold leaf. Milton brought in Broadway shows and famous orchestras, giving his workers access to culture that rivaled Philadelphia or New York. In 1936, Hershey Park Arena was completed for hockey, basketball, and conventions. In 1939, Hershey Park Stadium opened for concerts and sporting events with seating for more than 16,000. From 1930 to 1936, Milton spent more than $10 million on construction, roughly $200 million today. He employed hundreds when jobs were impossible to find. Hershey became famous across America as a beacon of hope during the Depression. From High Point Mansion, Milton could watch these monuments rising on the hilltops around his town. It must have seemed like the culmination of everything he had dreamed of. A perfect town thriving during America's darkest economic hour. But there were shadows beneath the sweetness, tensions that would explode into violence by 1937. Hershey, Pennsylvania looked like paradise. The streets were clean, the houses well-maintained, the parks beautifully landscaped. The air smelled perpetually of chocolate, a rich, sweet aroma that greeted residents every morning and lulled them to sleep at night. Workers earned wages that were higher than they could have found elsewhere, and they enjoyed benefits that were revolutionary for the era. pension plans, access to medical care, recreational facilities that most Americans could only dream of. From the windows of High Point, Milton Hershey could survey his creation with satisfaction. He had built something unprecedented, a town where capitalism and compassion coexisted, where workers prospered alongside their employer, where the American dream seemed not just possible, but guaranteed. But paradise had a price, and that price was control. Milton Hershey wasn't just an employer, he was the architect and owner of an entire world. He decided where the streets would be built and what they would be named. He determined which businesses could operate in town and which could not. He established the social calendar, the cultural offerings, the recreational opportunities. He created schools and determined their curricula. He built churches and influenced their congregations. He controlled the utilities, the transportation system, the retail stores. Everything in Hershey, Pennsylvania existed because Milton Hershey willed it into existence. And while this had created unprecedented prosperity and stability, it had also created an atmosphere of paternalism that some workers found increasingly suffocating. There was no municipal government in Hershey. Instead, the Hershey Improvement Company, later renamed Hershey Estates, served that function, providing electricity, telephone service, water, sewage systems, and all the infrastructure typically managed by elected officials. From 1927 onward, Hershey Estates oversaw 33 separate companies covering everything from birth to death. The Hershey Hospital to the Hershey Cemetery, the Hershey Park to the Hershey Zoo. The company monitored workers' private lives in ways that would seem unthinkable today. Management knew who drank too much, who kept an untidy home, who failed to maintain proper moral standards. This information appeared in personnel files and influenced career advancement. Hiring and firing decisions were often made based on personal relationships and favoritism rather than merit. Workers who attended church regularly and participated enthusiastically in company-sponsored activities found themselves promoted. Those who kept to themselves or questioned management decisions found their hours cut or their employment terminated. The company influenced which workers could purchase homes and which couldn't, which families received certain privileges and which didn't. For many workers, especially those who had known poverty and unemployment during the Depression, these concerns seemed like ingratitude. Milton Hershey had given them everything: good wages, nice homes, a beautiful town. How dare anyone complain about minor intrusions into their private lives? But for others, particularly younger workers and those influenced by the growing labor movement sweeping across America in the 1930s, the paternalism felt like a gilded cage. They had jobs and security, yes, but they had no voice, no agency, no ability to collectively negotiate for their own interests. And then, despite the apparent prosperity, working conditions began to deteriorate in ways that contradicted the public image of Hershey Paradise. The factory work was brutal. Temperatures inside often exceeded 100 degrees, especially in the summer months. The noise levels were so high that workers suffered hearing damage. The pace of production was relentless, with orders to speed up constantly pressuring workers to move faster, work harder, take fewer breaks. Men came home exhausted, their bodies aching from repetitive motions and physically demanding labor. Before the Depression, Hershey employees had been accustomed to 60-hour work weeks. When hours were cut to 40 per week, initially required by the National Recovery Administration, paychecks shrank dramatically. Many families had difficulty getting by on their reduced wages. And when Milton eliminated annual bonuses that workers had come to depend on, the financial strain increased. The workers saw that the Hershey Chocolate Corporation was making enormous profits, more than $37 million in after-tax profits between 1930 and 1936. They saw Milton spending $10 million on building monuments, hotels, and theaters and stadiums. But they were taking home less money than they had before the Depression. From the workers' perspective, the math didn't add up. The company was thriving. The owner was building palaces. But their paychecks had shrunk and their working conditions had deteriorated. In the last weeks of 1936, a newsletter began circulating in the Hershey factory. It was called The Chocolate Bar Bee, and its tone was inflammatory. The newsletter detailed workers' grievances, Low wages compared to the company's massive profits. Erratic work schedules that made it impossible to plan family life. Dangerous speed-up orders that led to injuries. The exhausting physical labor in extreme heat and deafening noise. The newsletter scolded the big bosses, company president William Murray and Milton Hershey himself, for their high salaries and slave-driving methods. It strongly advised workers to organize and unionize, and it was signed by the Communist Party of Hershey, Pennsylvania. The communist signature was likely more strategic than ideological, but for many in Hershey, it confirmed their worst fears. Outside agitators, communists, were trying to destroy their perfect town. In January 1937, organizers from the Congress of Industrial Organizations held a secret meeting at a firehouse in nearby Palmyra. The timing was not coincidental. Just weeks earlier, workers at General Motors plants in Flint, Michigan, had conducted a dramatic sit-down strike that lasted 44 days. Despite fierce opposition from the company and local authorities, the strikers had prevailed, forcing GM to recognize the United Auto Workers Union and agree to improved wages and working conditions. The Flint sit-down captured the imagination of workers across America. Sit-down strikes, where workers occupied their factories rather than simply picketing outside, had proven remarkably effective. By controlling the means of production, workers could shut down operations completely. Management couldn't bring in strikebreakers because the workers physically controlled the factory floor. Several hundred Hershey employees attended that January meeting in Palmyra. They formed a local chapter of the United Chocolate Workers Union affiliated with the CIO. Within weeks, membership swelled to several hundred. When the union first approached management in March, the response seemed conciliatory. The company agreed to raise minimum wages to 60 cents per hour for men and 45 cents for women. A meaningful increase that suggested conflict could be avoided. For a brief moment, it seemed like Milton Hershey's paternalistic vision could accommodate workers' desire for a voice. But then, the company laid off. Dozens of workers, including several prominent union organizers. Company president William Murray, who was deeply opposed to unions, called it routine seasonal cutbacks. The union saw it as retaliation and a violation of the wage agreement's implied promise of job security. Tensions escalated rapidly. Union leaders argued that the company was punishing workers for organizing, violating their rights under federal labor law. Management insisted that business decisions about staffing levels were prerogatives that no union could dictate. On April 1, 1937, union members met again at the Palmyra Firehouse. The mood was angry and determined. Union President Russell Bull Bayman, a physical giant of a man who had worked in the Hershey factory for years, called for action. The workers voted overwhelmingly to strike. The plan was simple. They would conduct a sit-down strike beginning the next morning. They would occupy the factory, shut down production, and force the company to negotiate in good faith. They believed, based on the GM victory in Flint, that a well-organized sit-down could succeed without violence, that the power of their collective action would bring management to the table. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, April the 2nd at 11 a.m., Bull Bayman stood outside the Hershey chocolate factory on Chocolate Avenue. He waved a red handkerchief, the prearranged signal. Within minutes, the great machines that had hummed day and night for decades fell silent. Workers sat down at their posts. Others walked outside to form picket lines. Hundreds climbed onto the roofs of factory buildings, visible to everyone in town, silhouetted against the Pennsylvania sky. Above the factory, replacing the American flag that usually flew there, the strikers raised the banner of the CIO. That act, more than anything else, would come to symbolize the strike, and would enrage those who saw it as desecration of everything Milton Hershey had built. The strike had begun, and from High Point Mansion on the ridge above the town, Milton Hershey watched as his workers rejected the paradise he had given them. The first few days of the strike felt almost festive. Strikers smiled for newspaper photographers and radio reporters who descended on Hershey to cover the unfolding drama. The sit-down was organized with impressive discipline. Workers rotated in shifts. A union kitchen provided meals. Surveillance teams monitored the factory to ensure no company property was damaged. Smoking was banned in sanitary areas. Entertainment was organized to keep spirits up. Workers sang songs, played cards, told stories. For the men inside, it felt more like a family squabble than an angry revolution, as one participant later recalled. These were men who had worked side by side for years, who lived on the same streets, whose children attended the same schools, who shared the same Pennsylvania Dutch heritage and Mennonite values. They weren't revolutionaries or radicals. They were asking for what seemed like basic fairness, recognition of their union, protection from arbitrary firings, a voice in decisions that affected their lives. But outside the factory, the mood was very different. The vast majority of Hershey's 3,000 factory workers wanted nothing to do with the strike. They saw it as betrayal of a man who had given them everything, an attack on the town they loved, an invitation for communist agitators to destroy their way of life. Many had grown up in Hershey, had gone to schools Milton built, had played in parks Milton created. The idea that their employer was their enemy seemed absurd and offensive. On April 3rd, the second day of the strike, a group called the Loyal Workers Club began organizing opposition. They held rallies denouncing the strikers as ungrateful communists. They circulated petitions demanding that the factory be reopened. They made it clear that they would not stand by while their town was destroyed by outside agitators. But the most intense opposition came from the dairy farmers. Hershey Chocolate Corporation purchased milk from dairy farms across 6 counties in central Pennsylvania. The factory processed massive quantities every single day. Estimates range from 60,000 to 70,000 gallons, perhaps as much as 800,000 pounds. This milk came from thousands of farming families for whom the Hershey contract was economic survival. Now, with the factory shut down, the milk sat spoiling. Farmers were dumping 800,000 pounds per day, enough to supply a city of 1 million people. Every gallon dumped represented lost income, money that farmers desperately needed to feed their families, pay their mortgages, survive from one season to the next. The farmers' anger was immediate and visceral. They hadn't asked to be involved in a labor dispute. They weren't taking sides on abstract questions about workers' rights or the union recognition. They simply needed the factory to open so they could sell their milk and avoid financial ruin. On Monday, April 5th, the 4th day of the strike, desperate dairy farmers met with union representatives. The meeting was tense. The farmers explained in plain language that they were losing everything. The union leaders, trying to show good faith and find common ground, agreed to a compromise. Strikers would operate the factory's creamery so the milk could be processed even while the strike continued. It seemed like a reasonable solution, a gesture of goodwill that might ease tensions and keep negotiations moving forward. The next day, Hershey's milkmen failed to pick up the milk. Whether this was a deliberate decision by company management or a logistical breakdown in the chaos of the strike remains unclear. But the result was predictable. The farmers' anger intensified dramatically. On the evening of April 6th, several thousand people marched through Palmyra in a massive rally. The crowd included loyal Hershey workers, dairy farmers from across the region, and members of various patriotic organizations. They carried signs denouncing the CIO as a communist organization bent on destroying American values. They proclaimed their loyalty to Milton Hershey and their determination to protect the town he had built. The speakers at the rally declared that the strikers had dishonored a heroic man who had given them everything. The CIO flag flying over the factory instead of the American flag was presented as proof of the strikers' un-American character, evidence that foreign ideologies had infected their perfect town. The crowd worked itself into a frenzy of righteous anger. People shouted, fists were raised. The energy was electric and dangerous. By the time the rally ended, something terrible had been unleashed, a collective rage that would not be easily contained. That night, from the windows of High Point Mansion, Milton Hershey might have seen the torches and lights from the rally in Palmyra, might have heard the distant sound of thousands of angry voices carrying on the April wind. He was 80 years old, and the empire he had spent his life building was tearing itself apart. The next morning would bring violence that no one could have imagined. By 11 o'clock on the morning of April 7th, more than 3,000 people had gathered outside the Hershey Chocolate Factory. The crowd was a mixture of dairy farmers, loyal Hershey workers, and men from surrounding towns who had come for the fight. They came armed, baseball bats, billy clubs, hammers, lead pipes, ice picks, pitchforks, axe handles. The weapons had materialized from somewhere, some brought by individuals, others distributed through the crowd in ways that suggested organization and planning. Who organized the mob? Who distributed the weapons? These questions would be debated for years. Union leaders and many strikers believed, and oral histories later suggested, that company officials had orchestrated the attack, that weapons had been provided by management, that dairy farmers who depended on Hershey contracts had been essentially forced to participate on threat of losing their livelihoods. The company insisted that the violence was a spontaneous uprising by citizens outraged at the strike's disruption of their community, that the mob had formed organically out of genuine anger and frustration. The truth likely fell somewhere in between. The dairy farmers' rage was genuine. They were genuinely facing financial ruin. Many loyal workers genuinely believed they were defending their town against communist agitators. But someone had armed them. Someone had organized them. Someone had turned anger into violence. At some point that morning, accounts differ on exactly when and who initiated it. The crowd sent an ultimatum to the strikers inside the factory. Evacuate by 12 noon or suffer the consequences. Inside, union leaders scrambled. Bull Behrman and the other organizers met urgently with William Murray, the company president. They agreed to end the strike immediately. Murray promised to announce this to the crowd and call off the mob. But by then, it was too late. The crowd had its own momentum, its own terrible logic. Just before 1 p.m., even as union leaders were announcing the strike's end to workers inside, the mob outside began to surge toward the factory. What happened next lasted perhaps 30 minutes, but those 30 minutes would haunt Hershey, Pennsylvania for generations. The anti-union crowd outnumbered the strikers 4-1, 3,000 against perhaps 700. They carried weapons designed to hurt, to maim, to punish. As they approached the factory, the mob began to roar, a sound like an animal, like a storm, like something primal and unstoppable. Inside, strikers realized what was coming. Some tried to barricade doors. Others looked for exits. Still others stood frozen, unable to believe that their neighbors, their fellow workers, men they had known for years, were about to attack them with weapons. There was an exchange of taunts and insults through the factory windows. Strikers shouted that they had already agreed to end the strike. The mob shouted back accusations of betrayal and communism. Then someone threw the first stone, and the violence began. The mob smashed through doors and shattered windows. They poured into the factory like a flood, spreading through the buildings in search of strikers. When they found workers trying to flee, they attacked them. The assault was swift and brutal. Workers were struck with baseball bats, clubs, and hammers. Ice picks and lead pipes were used as weapons. The sounds of the violence echoed through the factory halls as men fell under the blows. Dozens suffered severe injuries, broken bones, head trauma, and deep lacerations. The strikers tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and outgunned in terms of weapons. Most tried to run, fleeing through the factory seeking any exit, any escape from the mob that pursued them with terrible determination. The three union leaders, Bull Behrman, John Loy, and Miles Sweeney, the CIO, organizer, were targeted specifically. The mob knew who they were, had identified them as ringleaders. Sweeney suffered severe head injuries from repeated blows. John Loy sustained facial injuries including broken teeth and a fractured jaw. Bull Behrman, despite his size and strength, was overwhelmed by multiple attackers. As strikers fled the factory, the mob pursued them into the streets. Rocks and stones were hurled at running men. Workers who stumbled or fell faced further violence. The assault left its mark on Chocolate Avenue, the sweet street that Milton Hershey had named decades earlier, when he imagined a town where workers would live in harmony and prosperity. In less than 30 minutes, it was over. The mob, having accomplished its goal of clearing the factory, began to disperse. Farmers returned to their dairy operations for the evening milking. Loyal workers went home to their families. The streets of Hershey slowly emptied as the adrenaline faded, and the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. 25 strikers were hospitalized with serious injuries. Dozens more had been attacked, but managed to avoid hospitalization, nursing their wounds at home. The injuries ranged from cuts, bruises, and broken noses to fractured bones, severe concussions, and puncture wounds. Several men would carry permanent scars, physical reminders of the day their neighbors turned on them. The factory stood quiet, its windows broken, its floors bearing the evidence of violence. The machines that had hummed constantly for decades remained silent. And above the town, from the windows of High Point Mansion, Milton Hershey surveyed the wreckage of his perfect world. The violence that had erupted on his factory floor was violence that never should have happened in the paradise he had created. Workers who should have been grateful had struck against him. Farmers who depended on him had stormed his factory with weapons. Neighbors had beaten neighbors. Blood had been spilled on streets he had built, in buildings he had constructed, in a town that bore his name. Paradise had burned, and nothing would ever be the same. The political response was immediate. Pennsylvania Governor George Earle called the violence a disgrace and publicly blamed the Derry Township Sheriff for failing to prevent the mob from entering the factory. The National Labor Relations Board dispatched investigators to Hershey to determine what had happened and whether the company had violated federal labor law. But determining the truth proved difficult. The company insisted that the violence had been a spontaneous uprising by citizens outraged at the strike's disruption. Union leaders believed, and many strikers testified, that the attack had been orchestrated by company officials, with weapons distributed to loyalists and farmers forced to participate. Evidence suggested both were partially true. The dairy farmers' desperation was real. Many loyal workers genuinely believed they were defending their town, but the weapons came from somewhere. The mob was organized, and company officials at minimum did nothing to prevent the violence, despite having advance warning that it was coming. 2 weeks after the strike's violent end, the NLRB supervised a union election at the chocolate factory. Workers overwhelmingly chose the Independent Chocolate Workers, a small loyalist organization, over the CIO. It seemed like vindication of Milton Hershey's paternalistic vision, proof that his workers had rejected outside agitators. But the NLRB wasn't finished. Investigators continued examining the company's practices and the circumstances of the violence. In 1939, 2 years later, the NLRB issued its ruling. The Independent Chocolate Workers was an illegal company union created and controlled by management. The election had not been legitimate. The workers would have to vote again. This time, still wary of the CIO, workers selected Local 464 of the Bakery and Confectionery Workers International Union, affiliated with the more conservative American Federation of Labor. The new contract gave workers overtime pay, paid vacations, and, crucially, a formal grievance procedure that allowed them to challenge management decisions through arbitration rather than accepting whatever the company decided. The chocolate workers had finally won the right to a voice in their own working conditions, but the victory came at a terrible price. Milton Hershey was 80 years old in 1937, and the strike devastated him emotionally. The strike changed him, recalled William Murray years later. He was deeply hurt and felt all he had done for the town had been forgotten. Milton had built Hershey, Pennsylvania, from nothing. He had created thousands of jobs during the Depression. He had spent millions building monuments and providing his workers with wages and benefits that most industrial workers could only dream of. He had poured his fortune into creating a town that would endure for generations. And his workers had repaid him, as he saw it, with ingratitude and betrayal. They had struck against him. They had shut down his factory. They had rejected his benevolence. Of course, this interpretation ignored the workers' legitimate grievances about wages, hours, dangerous working conditions, and arbitrary management decisions. It ignored the paternalism that had made some workers feel like children who needed permission to live their own lives. And it certainly ignored the brutal violence that loyal workers and farmers had inflicted on their neighbors. But Milton Hershey couldn't see those complexities. To him, it felt like personal betrayal. He withdrew from the daily operations of both the chocolate company and the town. He spent more time at High Point, surrounded by memories of Catherine, of better days when the vision had seemed pure and the future unlimited. From the mansion's windows, he could still see his town spread out below. But now, when he looked down at the chocolate factory, did he see the blood that had stained its floors? Did he remember the sound of the mob, the screams of beaten men? Did he question whether his perfect town had been an illusion all along? Milton Hershey died on October 13th, 1945, at the age of 88. His funeral was one of the largest ever seen in central Pennsylvania. Thousands lined the streets. Factory whistles blew in tribute. Businesses closed. Whatever complicated feelings people had about the strike and its aftermath, there was no question that Milton Hershey had been an extraordinary man who had created something unprecedented. The trust he had established in 1918 would continue to grow. Today it is worth more than $17 billion, making the Milton Hershey School one of the wealthiest educational institutions in America, still providing opportunities to children who need them most. Today, Hershey, Pennsylvania, continues to draw millions of visitors each year. They come to ride roller coasters in Hershey Park, to tour the chocolate attractions, to stay in the Grand Hotel Hershey, to walk streets named Chocolate and Cocoa Avenue. They experience the town that Milton Hershey built, the monuments he created during the Depression, the legacy of his vision. Most visitors never learn about April 7th, 1937. They don't know about the violence that erupted when workers demanded a voice in their own lives. They don't think about the injuries sustained on the factory floors, or the weapons used against fleeing workers on streets built by the man who wanted to create paradise. They see the success story, an uneducated boy who failed repeatedly before finding his calling, a self-made millionaire who gave his fortune away to educate orphan children, a visionary who built a town that provided good jobs and quality of life for thousands of families. All of this is true. Milton Hershey was an extraordinary man who accomplished extraordinary things. The Milton Hershey School has changed countless lives. The town of Hershey has prospered for more than a century. The philanthropy was real, and its positive effects continue today. But the 1937 strike and its brutal suppression reveals something equally true. That benevolence without democracy is still control. That generosity without respect is still paternalism. That paradise built by one man's vision alone is ultimately unstable because it denies the fundamental human need for agency and voice. High Point Mansion has served many purposes since Milton's death. For years, it housed the Hershey Country Club. Later, it became corporate offices for the Hershey Company and Hershey Trust. Today, portions have been restored to their original appearance and serve as an educational experience primarily for students of the Milton Hershey School. The house still stands on its limestone ridge, overlooking the town that chocolate built. From its windows, you can still see the grid of streets Milton laid out, the parks he designed, the monuments he built during the Depression. You can see the chocolate factory still operating, still producing the candy that made Hershey famous. But if you know the history, if you understand what happened on that April morning in 1937, you see something else too. You see the streets where a mob chased fleeing workers. You see the factory where neighbors beat neighbors with baseball bats and ice picks. You see the paternalistic control that bred resentment even as it provided prosperity. The mansion is elegant and well preserved, a testament to one man's success and vision. But it also stands as a monument to the limitations of individual benevolence, no matter how sincere. Milton Hershey tried to build paradise. He came closer than most, but he learned in the end that paradise cannot be imposed from above. It must be built together by people who have a say in their own lives. 25 workers were hospitalized on April 7th, 1937. Their names have been largely forgotten, their stories buried beneath the more palatable narrative of chocolate and philanthropy. But their blood was real. Their injuries were real. The violence they suffered at the hands of their neighbors was real. And the lesson they taught, that even the most benevolent control is still control, that workers deserve not just good wages, but dignity and voice, that gratitude should never require silence in the face of injustice, remains as relevant today as it was the terrible morning when paradise burned. High Point stands witness to all of it, the triumphs and the tragedies, the vision and the violence, the sweetness and the blood. From its windows, the view remains as spectacular as ever. The rolling Pennsylvania hills, the chocolate factory, the town spreading out in neat grids below. But the ghosts remain too, whispers in the walls, memories in the floorboards. The ghost of Catherine Hershey, who died too young. The ghost of Milton himself, an old man betrayed by the ingratitude of those he had tried to help, and the ghosts of April 7th, the workers who were attacked, the farmers who wielded clubs, the neighbors who turned on each other in an outbreak of violence that no one could have imagined in this town that smelled like chocolate and promised paradise. The mansion endures, the chocolate flows, the sweet smell still drifts across the Pennsylvania hills. And the dark story of April 7th, 1937 reminds us that even the grandest houses can contain the darkest secrets, and that the most benevolent visions can cast the longest shadows. This is the legacy of High Point, not just a mansion on a hill, but a monument to the eternal tension between control and freedom, between benevolence and autonomy, between one man's vision of paradise and his workers' demand